Holy Censorship or Mistranslation. Welcome to the Priceless Podcast. Hello everyone and welcome to the Priceless Podcast. I am your host, Michael Secen. This podcast is made in partnership with the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups. Today I have a guest that I already talked to, but you will probably listen to that part that we recorded after this podcast, because I want to publish this podcast first, so you know this will be a two-part podcast. My guest is Renato LIngs, and he's so many things that it's even hard to introduce him. He studied so many things. He started with Spanish and the Spanish literature. He's an author and he wrote several books on homosexuality and the Bible. And today we're going to be talking mostly about his last book that was published last year, as mentioned in the title of this podcast, Holy Censorship or Mistranslation, Love, Gender, and Sexuality in the Bible. But before we get into this book, hello, Renato. We already had an interview and a mishap where we started recording and I totally forgot to press record. So many of the things we already said are unfortunately lost, not in translation, but in not recording it. So, how are you after all of this? Do you still have strength to do this?
Yes, thank you very much, Michael, for hanging in there and against storm and sea. I am also with you, and I'm quite happy to continue because this is such an interesting exchange we're having. So yes, there's still some energy and some willingness and enthusiasm left with me. So let's go for it.
So, you wrote two books. Two books. You wrote three, let's say three books, two books in English. One book that is in English is called Love Lost in Translation, Homosexuality in the Bible. And the last book that was published last year, if I'm right, in around June 2021, is Holy Censorship or Mistranslation, Love, Gender, and Sexuality in the Bible. So we're probably mostly going to talk about the second book, but we're also going to talk about everything in general. So can you tell us, you wrote two books that are on a similar topic. So what is the difference between those two books?
Sure. Originally, I wanted to publish my PhD thesis, which was on Sodom and Gomorrah, and the title was Restoring Sodom Towards a Non-Sexual Approach. That was sort of perhaps the main finding in my research, was that there is no sexual story there. Unlike what many commentators want us to believe, because it's not in the Hebrew. That comes in much later in the Hellenistic era. So, but for some reason or several reasons, it was not possible to publish it entirely. So it had to wait for a while. And I first published in Spanish, incidentally, in 2011. That's a whole story about that, but that came out in 2011. Where some part of my material on Sodom and Gomorrah was included. And then in 2013, I was finally able to publish in English, where some chapters also definitely are based on my PhD thesis on Sodom and Gomorrah, but it includes a lot of other texts as well. So, and then you may ask, why publish another book in English if you already have dealt with a lot of this stuff in your previous work? Well, there are two reasons for this. As you can see, Love Lost in Translations is quite a respectable book and weighty too, right? It's quite a tome, as some people say. And I agree with them because it has a lot of stuff in it, and most of it is very good stuff as far as I'm concerned. But, some people, when they see it, they say, yeah, interesting, isn't it? But maybe not today. And I can understand that because it doesn't fit into anybody's pocket easily, right? So people think about it a little bit. So that's where I learned my lesson over time that I think I need to publish something shorter to make it more accessible to people. And that's where also the Lutheran Church of Sweden came in. Because I've been to Sweden several times. In fact, this is interesting. I'm a Danish citizen, but I've had more response to my work in Sweden, where I have published nothing. But I have visited Sweden a number of times and given a number of workshops. And so this, I don't know, maybe this is to prove, the biblical saying of nobody is a prophet in their hometown. That's certainly true for me because, as I said, in Sweden, I've had a lot more response to my work than in Denmark, where I should have had some. But anyway, because I have published something in Danish. But
so it's not
Swedish.
Only that you are not a prophet in your hometown, but not even home country.
Exactly. It's amazing, isn't it? So I can confirm that saying in the Bible. That's definitely my case. But at least the Church of Sweden is very much interested in my work and supports me. So, which is great. That at least one major church in Scandinavia, is on my side. And so with them, we came the idea. We were discussing it. So came the idea of producing a much shorter book, and the book that came out of it eventually and was published last year is less than half of this one, and weighs much less than half to it. It's a very easy, handy book, and so very attractive, actually. Incidentally, good design too. So and it has become a success. Quite a success compared with the previous one, which has been well received, but sales have been slow. This is selling better and is receiving more reviews, so which is great news because I want my message to get out there. But this is a reason why. And then of course, now that I'm publishing a new book, I also added a few subjects that were not covered in my previous work, and I've maybe also taken one or two chapters out that I no longer feel perhaps are so relevant. So I've added new material. So it's not exactly the same book, just in a shorter version. It's a similar book, but with some differences too. Because I always find that when I write and when I publish, I always make changes to what I've done before. I don't want just to repeat myself.
Yeah. Is it, if people want to dive in a little bit deeper, it would be good for them to also have the first book? Is it? I guess it's more extensive.
I would say that the first book, Love Lost in Translation, is very helpful for those who really want to know about details. People who are patient and who love, to digging in deeply into a text and what are the words used here and how do they relate to each other. That's where this book comes in very well, because I have lots of stuff discussing translation techniques even. So for people who are interested in that aspect, this is a great book. And this also gives you some insight, but it's much shorter. So it's more accessible to, I would say, to a wider public.
Yeah.
Because it's much easier to read. Chapters are shorter too.
So from what I know is that you love to research and put a lot of time into research. So do you know how much time you invested to do all of your research you did for those two books?
I have no idea, but I would definitely start by saying thousands of hours. And it's my PhD thesis took me 4 years, and I still felt I was running out of time. But I had to submit, so that it stopped right there. But I could have easily used 1 or 2 more months. So that's 4 years for starters, and not to mention all the books I read before I even started on my PhD. there's months and months of work there too. And then since then, I don't know, it probably adds up to 8-10 years when you, if you might try to say, to give a sort of a specific time frame, but it's spread out over 20-30 years altogether.
Yeah. So we talked about, I don't remember if we talked about it in this interview, but it did appear. So you talked about how much it really helped for you to write all of this as someone who has a lot of experience in translating.
Yes.
And there are so many words that are often mistranslated. So
yes.
Can you maybe give us a glimpse for us who don't know what goes into translation, what it takes to translate something, what are the challenges, but also give an example of, something that is mistranslated in the Bible?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, you don't have to go very far in the Bible. The first the mistranslations begin really early. But one that is particularly egregious, if I may use that word, is in chapter 2 of Genesis, where you have the famous story of the human being who's feeling lonely. And the Creator watches this and says, it's not good for the human being to be alone. This is the first time in the creation story where something is not good, because everything up to this point has been good. And God saw it was good. And this then means that something has to be done. And the Creator brings in this interesting idea of introducing all the animals to the human being, and the animals don't yet have a name. And so the human being, created in the image of the Creator, now has to exercise its creativity. And thousands of animals and creatures come by, and the human being is naming them all. Now, that exercise is interesting, but it doesn't help his loneliness. Or its loneliness, I should say it, because this human being is undefined in terms of gender, which many people don't realize. But at this point in the story, Hebrew story, this human being is an it. It's not he or she, or it's both. So there's something curious going on about here gender-wise. So the Creator realizes that was not enough, so something else has to be done. And looking at the body of this human being, this Adam in the Hebrew, the Creator makes a decision. Aha, something different has to be done. Okay, this body is both male and female. If I divide it in two, we can have two human beings, one female and one male. And this is then where the Adam is lulled to sleep, and the Creator, according to translators, takes a rib out and creates a woman from that one bone. I've always found that a bit strange, that story. How can you create one human being with one bone from the body? It takes more than that, doesn't it? So even from my childhood, I was a bit puzzled by this story. And sure enough, if you read the Hebrew carefully, you can see there is no word meaning rib in that story at all. The word that is there actually is used in many different places throughout the Hebrew scriptures, and it means usually a side. You find the side of a room, the side of a box, the side of a house, a mountain side and a hillside. Still always the same word, and that's the word you find in this very story. So the Creator took one side from the Adam and made it into a woman, leaving the other side male. So now you have the two sides separated. Now you have a female and a male. So, and when they are then finally introduced to each other, That's what the Creator wants them. They want them to know each other so that the loneliness can disappear. Now that they are two,
Yeah.
the male exclaims, seeing the female coming towards him, "Ah, at last, here, this is it. Here is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." So he's actually saying, yes, it took flesh and bones to create this woman, not just one bone. So it's in the very story that she's not made of one rib, okay? But yet the mistake remains there. After all these centuries, most translators today, I would say 90+%, are still putting rib in that place, even if there is no word meaning rib, because the only word is there means side. It's amazing. It was shocking to find that for me.
Yeah. Do you know why is it? Like, did you maybe even have a chance to ask someone who is translating why they use the word rib?
The few people, I've tried, but I gave up very quickly because tradition is stronger than me. I'm just a person, and I'm not very famous in academic circles because I started my biblical studies career very late. So, I didn't start, from scratch and work my way all the way up to the top. I've never been a professor, at a famous university. So people don't really take me that seriously in those circles.
Yeah.
And the argument they will give, well, you see, there are some places where actually it could mean rib. And I just say, oh. And then they give me an example or two of a building where there's a side panel somewhere that they interpret as ribs, but I still see the side in that particular passage, and it means side everywhere else. So why choose a translation that is debatable rather than use the obvious one? That is my point. So that's my argument. But it's amazing to see how that tradition is still there after all these years, 2,000 years, we might say. We have been living under the shadow of Adam's rib, even if there is no rib in that story.
And I think this is why it's so important that we have different people with different life experiences, different genders, different races looking at the Bible and actually seeing all those things that are translated, using and being tradition because of tradition and not really because of the meaning, because, at the end, white, straight men probably won't be aware of how it influenced so many lives, all these mistranslations. So you're asking this question, holy censorship or mistranslation? Did you get an answer?
I think I've found an answer, at least that worked for me. I'm seeing that the people who have been translating these texts over the many years, over the centuries, aren't even aware to what extent they have been exercising censorship, but it is censorship. And because they have been raised in a male-centered culture where male is king, so to speak, and female is inferior. And so it has worked well for them to read the story that way, that she was created from his rib, which makes her secondary, inferior. And if you read the church fathers, we're now back in the 3rd, 4th centuries, more or less, read them and the way they interpret the story and what they write about women, you will be horrified. You will be horrified. Because what they're saying about women is not biblical. But it's misogynist, and they are quoting Aristotle and other Greek philosophers who were very misogynistic. So that misogyny became part of Christianity through the church fathers. It's not really that much in the Bible yet. Of course, the Bible was written at a time when the male male-centered culture would make men king and rulers. Yes, that is true. But the texts themselves simply reflect the culture in which they were written. But I wouldn't call them misogynistic in that sense. They're simply a reflection of the culture. But the misogyny came in later with the church fathers, who actually looked down, despised women, and wrote, as I said, horrific stuff about them. It's not edifying. I don't recommend it. You probably won't enjoy it. But that culture became ingrained in Christianity because they are the church fathers, St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, Saint whatever. And they loom large on the horizon. And I've come to realize in my work that the church fathers, they are present at the table whenever people today are sitting down to study the Bible. They are the invisible presence there in the room, the church fathers. People are still using them. Their lens, their filter to read the text. So misogyny is part of a huge part of the problem when we have this mistranslation still occurring today after all these many years. It's absolutely amazing.
Wow. So we talked about, a word that is very obvious. You mentioned, the Hebrew word that was that obviously means side, but it was translated as rib. But we also know that there are other words that are not so clear or are not mentioned that often in other literature. So how do you tackle something like this?
Yes, it's hard. It's hard. I'm thinking about one particular verse in the book of Leviticus. You find it in chapter 18, and it is repeated and amplified, expanded in chapter 20. But it's basically the same verse where, according to translators, today's translations, okay? According to today's translations, it says, "Where the man you shall not have sex as with a woman, it is an abomination," or "it is detestable," or whatever they say. So there's this thing with a man as with a woman, according to the translations. And I've always been a little bit mystified by that. What exactly does it mean as with a woman? Okay, how can you, in the first place, have sex exactly with a man as with a woman? That, for me, is question number one, and so on. And you can ask more questions along those lines. Okay, but then I'm now in the field of biblical studies, and so I look at the Hebrew and saying, what exactly does the Hebrew say? And I can see there's no man there in the first place, and there's no phrase meaning as with a woman. So what's going on? And then I try to produce a literal translation of what I see. And I'm seeing, "And with a male you shall not lie down." Up until that point, we are sort of doing okay, because those words are fairly straightforward. But then you have a strange thing happening. "You shall not lie down the lyings down of a woman or of a wife." Okay, what does that mean? The lyings down of a wife or a woman. Okay, so you have a very strange phrase. You don't find it anywhere else in the Bible, this construction. So there's a huge debate out there, actually. When you really search the horizon, you go on the internet and you look for commentaries on this article. I have now, in this book, I think I've placed 18 different interpretations of this verse. Okay. Since that time, I found another one, and that in the Spanish version it became 19 interpretations. And just a month ago, I found one more. So now I've got 20. I've got 20 different interpretations to explain where people have different approaches to this verse, what exactly is meant. Who is being addressed? Well, that's fairly straightforward. A male Israelite, according to the Hebrew text. But what does that woman or wife stuff mean? That seems to qualify the way you're not supposed to have sex with a male. that is being explained through that other phrase, but nobody really knows what that phrase means, okay? So, but yet, I would say a very high percentage, maybe 90 or 90 plus, of all translators today, they will give you an idea of, well, you see, it's basically about male homosexuality, okay? That's being prohibited. God doesn't like that because it's against nature. So they write accordingly. And you have translators say you shall not have sex with a man as with a woman, or you shall not practice male homosexuality, and da-da-da-da-da-da. But it's actually not what the Hebrew is saying. That's what they think it ought to be saying. But that comes then from the translator's own baggage, bringing it to the text, rather than going where I feel the real translator should go. You should actually spend some time with the text until you feel familiar with it, and until you begin to see what does this mean, or what did it mean maybe several thousand years ago, and then you work from there, trying to put. But most translators, they bring the baggage they have learned from their commentaries and from the courses they did in Bible college, and boom, because they were taught that's what that text means, so they translated accordingly. But for me, that's not translation, that's mistranslation.
So how would you translate this part?
That's a very good question, because that's it puts the ball back in my court, right? So what am I supposed to do? So what I do, and in fact, I accept the challenge. I don't have a ready answer to give you today, but I'm working on it.
Yeah.
It's taken me years, actually, to find a proper translation. I think what I would do, if I'm asked, for example, if somebody comes along and say, we are preparing a new Bible translation, okay, and would you like to help us? And would you translate Leviticus for us, right? What would I say in that verse? That's basically what your question is, right? I think I will try to be as literal as possible, because I don't really know what it means. That means I should not move away from the text. I should stay close to it and leave whatever doubt, whatever uncertainty I have, leave that with the reader, because it's with me. So how can I make the reader certain about something I'm not certain about? So I would say something like, how about this? With a male you shall not lie down. Because lying down, plural, also can mean beds. You shall not lie down the beds of a wife. Why do I say wife, not woman? Because the word woman that all translators use, because that makes a nice comparison. With a man, you shall not do that, with a woman. Then you have a parallel or symmetry even in the phrase. That's not there in the Hebrew. You have a male, you have not a man, you have a male, but you don't have a female at the other end. So there's no symmetry there. You have a male and then you have a wife. Because the word woman, when in relation to a man, usually means his wife. His woman is his wife. So you have a male and a wife at opposite ends in this phrase. So how do you combine those two? That's why I'm struggling. I don't know how to do that. So I have to do it very literally and place a little footnote at the bottom of the page saying the text is unclear. That for me is the honest translation.
And that's actually something I read about you. That's why I wanted to ask you this question, because I read where you somewhere said, why not leave the mystery with the reader, because it's a mystery to all of us. And yes. I like how you said that. So good work. It wasn't supposed to be a test, but if it was, you would have passed. So what can people expect? And maybe you already said, but if I as a reader take this book, what am I supposed to expect for myself with this book?
At least I don't want to sound too much like I'm in the business of PR, right? But I think from this particular book, it has some surprises for you. I that you'll be surprised more than once about seeing the story that I'm seeing in the Bible, because my point, is going beyond the translations we all have sitting on our shelves somewhere, going beyond those and actually going to the sources, right? And see what was there from the beginning, or at least from as far back as we can go, because nobody really knows where the beginnings are. It all, it's lost in prehistory and oral traditions and all that. But anyway, so you'll find some surprises, and I think most of them you'll find pleasant surprises, because we've been told over and over, you and me and many others, that the Bible is very, very strict about same-sex relationships. It's the worst thing, probably because it's against nature and it's against God's will and blah, 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 and all that stuff. That's not what is there at all. That is not there at all. And in fact, we've almost, people like you and me, and I'm talking about LGBTQ Christians now, okay? We've almost been taught that that's the worst thing you can do with your life. And I'm sorry, folks, but that is not what the Bible's saying. If you really want to know what sin, the word sin, means in the biblical context, I'm also discussing that. That is not about sex. It's called idolatry. Over and over and over, the Bible is protesting against idolatry, worshipping the wrong gods. And who cannot think about a few wrong gods that are being worshipped in our culture today? I can think of a handful. Those are the ones that the Bible is really, really getting worked up and angry about. But not about your sex life or about your orientation. No way. No way. That story, I'm sorry, I don't buy that anymore. And I'm now, and this book explains why I don't buy that anymore. And there's so many other good things that you can take away from the Bible. And this is the other side of the book that you may also surprise you. One half of it, say, is based on the things that you don't need to fear from the Bible. We've been taught to fear, and you don't have to. That's what I'm documenting here. And the other side is all the good stuff you'll find in there too, that we have forgotten about, or we've not even been taught to see, because we've always been, focusing on the wrong texts. So all the good texts that are there, and what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, for example, the 4 love stories. Okay? 4 strong love stories that are being celebrated. I mean, celebrated in the Bible, okay? You have the story of 2 women in the book of Ruth, whose story is celebrated by the narrator and by the community of Bethlehem, where they live. You have the story of 2 males, Jonathan and David. Both of them, one is married when their relationship begins and the other one marries eventually. And we don't know whether or not that is there's anything sexual there, but because the narrator is not concerned about it. But there's a very strong affectionate bonding going on between these 2 males that even goes beyond death. Because after Jonathan's death, David looks after Jonathan's family, because of the bonding that was between these 2 males. So there's another strong story there. And the Bible itself uses the word love to describe it between them. So those 2 stories. And you go to the New Testament, it's often said that Jesus has nothing to say about homosexuality. So why should you? So, it's even used as an argument against those who use the Bible in a fundamentalistic fashion to bash us on our heads, right? But I'm not so sure that he didn't. He talks, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew about the eunuchs, and he classifies them in 3 different ways. There are 3 groups of eunuchs, and I feel comfortable. I think I fit into at least one of those categories very well. And the other thing is a story about the other story is about the Roman centurion who is desperate because his boy is severely ill and in pain, and he has probably been seeing all the doctors in the area, and nobody has helped him. So what does he do? Well, the last resort, there's this preacher called Jesus. Why not try him? So he comes to Jesus. And this is really an amazing story when you think of it, because he represents the Roman Empire right? He's a Roman officer, represents, the military occupation force in Palestine. So he's on top in the hierarchy. And Jesus is a poor itinerant preacher, right? Walking the roads of Galilee at this stage. So imagine somebody from the very top coming to somebody at the bottom, asking him for help. It's an amazing story. That shows me many things, but among other things, that the Roman centurion is desperate. He's trying the last resort. So he comes to Jesus, please help. My boy is severely ill and in pain. And Jesus cures him. Now, as far as I read the story, the Greek is highly suggestive of a strong, intimate relationship between this officer and his boy. Because this word boy means several things. Most translators prefer to think it means servant. It can mean servant in some contexts, but not necessarily. But if you look at it from the point of view of Greek pederasty, the relationship between an adult male and his young male lover, this fits perfectly. And that's why he calls him his boy, because he's younger than himself. Because that's the typical form of same-sex relationships in Hellenistic and Roman culture, is precisely pederasty between an adult male and a young male and a teenage male lover. So I'm seeing that there in that story, and you have it in two Gospels, both in Matthew and in Luke. And finally, another amazing love story, which is also kind of misinterpreted in to some extent, because you find it only in the fourth Gospel. And it's called the Gospel of John, because that tradition tells us this is the Gospel of John. But there's nothing in the Gospel itself revealing anything about John. There's actually absolutely nothing there. So, and this is where you find the story of the beloved disciple. Okay, and it begins in chapter 11. So one half of the Gospel, there are certain things announcing the story in the beginning of the Gospel, but the second half of the Gospel story, he's present, and it's a he, and he's a he. It's not Mary Magdalene, as some people think. It's a he, and his name is probably not John, because, as I said, there's nothing in the gospel in that particular Gospel indicating that John has anything to do with the beloved disciple. Well, he may be a co-disciple, but it's not him. So I bring in a different name because I analyze the story and who's the most likely candidate according to the evidence. Well, his name is not John, but Lazarus. Lazarus the Bethany, he's called back from death to life. It's a spectacular presentation that the gospel writer is giving of Lazarus. I think it's probably the most spectacular miracle of all that are happening in the New Testament. So he's been introduced through the wide gate, basically. And 3 times in that same chapter 11, it's mentioned that Jesus loves him. So what I'm saying is, what more do you want when we talk about the beloved disciple? He's mentioned 3 times as one Jesus loves, and Jesus brings him back to life from death. And so, because the name of Lazarus disappears, but the name beloved disciple appears for the rest of the gospel, then people think, oh, that's where John comes in. I don't think so. I think the beloved disciple has been introduced. We don't need his name any longer. The gospel writer simply calls him beloved disciple from then on. And maybe, this is another theory of mine. It's a theory because we'll never know. Maybe the gospel was written by Lazarus himself. And that's why he humbly decides just to hide behind the synonym beloved disciple. Who knows? Or an alias. Anyway, but we have these 4 amazing love stories in the Bible that are very close and dear to our hearts, and we can now claim them for ourselves. And this is what the Bible has done for me, having, faced all my demons in the stories that have been used against me, I can now lay those demons to rest, because they are not real, and I know their names, and I can face them, and they have no power over me anymore. I'm now able to see those love stories that are there, and they're amazing, absolutely amazing. And on top of that, I'm able to deal with. I've now been able to see the origins of the doctrine of original sin, which has played a huge part, in our oppression, because we are supposed, LGBTQ people are supposed to represent original sin worse than anyone else, by being supposedly unnatural and against the will of God and all that stuff. But the doctrine of original sin is post-biblical, and it has only a vague basis in the letters of Paul, but the one who really turns it into something big is Augustine of Hippo. He turns it into a doctrine, and it was adopted by the church, and it's still the doctrine of most churches, in the major doctrine in most churches today. After these 1600 years, I can't believe it, because it's being contradicted by other parts of the Bible. So people think they're being very biblical. Oh, well, the fall in the Garden of Eden, and humanity sinned and what have you, and that sin follows, all generations from there and so on. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. If you read your Bible carefully, that story can be interpreted in many different ways, and Judaism does not understand the doctrine of original sin. They don't have it, and yet they read it in the Hebrew. What happens with Augustine? Did he know any Hebrew? Sorry, no. He read his creation story in a Latin translation, which is not exactly the same. So he drew his conclusion from the Latin. And so that explains why that became such a huge thing in Christianity. Christianity is basically mounted. Most of its doctrines are based on translations into Greek first and then into Latin. Because Christianity for centuries lost all touch with Hebrew. That was for Jews, not for good Christians. We would read it in Latin or Greek throughout the Middle Ages. Now, where was I? The doctrine of original sin. Yes, because if you go to the book of Exodus and if you go to the book of Deuteronomy, it states very clearly that God is merciful and will visit the sins of the fathers on the second and third generation, and maybe even the fourth. But from there on, no more shall they be held responsible for the sins of their ancestors. And it's like, wow, the very Bible says there is nothing called original sin. Right there. So that's been a huge discovery for me. But I have trouble with many theologians because they've all been trained to preach the.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
There's a whole different work to be done over there. But at least I'm happy to have achieved, at least for myself, peace of mind and peace of heart, and peace with God and peace with the Bible. Thanks to my biblical, I'm just so happy to have done this, and I feel I'm a much better person for it.
So you mentioned your colleagues, theologians, who have a difficult time with you. So I have to ask you this evil question of, what is the difference of you're talking about holy censorship and misinterpretation, about tradition and bringing, your own interpretation into things. So what would you say is different from what you bring when you talk about these stories in a different way? Why is it different?
I think the difference is that if, having now done my own work, I feel energized. I feel energized by the Bible. For me, the Bible has become a friend, and a good friend by that. And good friends often, keep secrets. They don't share their full story with you during the first month or the first year. It may take a lifetime to discover all the secrets of it. And that's the relationship I have now acquired with the Bible. There's still some corners there I find obscure, and some I have hardly visited. or very superficially. So there's a lot in there to be discovered for me. But I do it with a smile. Always, always open the Bible with a smile. It's like, wow, I wonder what surprises am I going to find today. So that's what it does for me, having this kind of relationship, you might call it, with the Bible. Because now it's more like a dialogue. It's not this law book, that people would hit me over the head with it. No, it doesn't work that way. Rather, it speaks story that are different from mine and similar to mine at the same time. Because, the whole Bible was basically written down to explain something. How does it work? The relationship between God and human beings. How does it work? And here are some examples. That's basically what the Bible is. Lots of examples of how God and humans interact with each other. And that's why I find very really interesting. I can sort of reflect myself in it. I can mirror myself in it sometimes. See, oh yeah, this is just like my experience. And some things are very difficult for me to understand. But that maybe that somebody else had that experience at another time, or they interpreted their experience that way, even if I may interpret it differently. Like, some of the gruesome, horrific stories about, genocide and slaughter in some parts of the Old Testament. Anyway, that's how they understood it at the time. I may see it very differently from where I am. But the Bible is just full of such interesting and even contradictory passages, which I also love, because life itself is like that. My life also has some contradictions in it. I don't always, follow a straight line through the week. Maybe I make some deviations here or there, go in a different direction this week than last week. What do I know? My life is a bit like that, a bit wayward, if you like. And the Bible also has, because many, many different voices contributed to the Bible. But that's also part of the fascination. There's not just one voice speaking here. And that's where fundamentalists get it so, and from my point of view, get it so terribly wrong. They think there is just one Bible and one voice. Sorry. No. God has spoken to a lot of people who have contributed to this book. So you get many different messages. Sometimes they clash. But that's part of also our struggle in life. We have to face our own contradictions and see how we can try to find some unity, even within ourselves and our own contradictory tendencies and desires and wishes and dreams and what have you. We're not all just black and white. We're all rainbow colored.
It's actually a very Judaistic, do you say it that way? Judaistic way of looking at the Bible,
Yes.
That's one thing I really loved, this way of approaching like theological thinking that is in Christianity doesn't exist in Judaism as much as it does in Christianity. They are much more open to having new rabbis with having new approaches to those holy texts. So what I actually hear from you, it's not a problem that we have different interpretations and experiences with what we read, but the way we then use them on others and make rules or even doctrines out of them is a huge problem.
It is. One thing I have, now that you mentioned Jewish theology and traditions, one thing I have learned from some Jewish theologians is, or at least one of the principles that some of them practice is, God loves our questions. And that's precisely the opposite of the fundamentalistic approach. Where we've got all the answers right here. It's in the Bible.
Yeah.
Where they start at the other end of the spectrum, saying, no, God loves to hear our questions. Because then we can work our way to find an answer. Rather than having all the answers served at you right away, because then it's all done. Or is it? Because even in fundamentalist circles, some people have a difficult time in absorbing the Bible, and for obvious reasons, for what we're saying here. So I like aspects of Jewish theology. They have taught me a lot. And because when you read those very devout Jewish rabbis who have spent a lot of time trying to understand and interpret the Bible, there's a humility there in them vis-a-vis the text. Not the kind of humility that the fundamentalists want you to say amen to. You know, here's the Bible, take it, okay, and don't ask any questions. No, here with them it's more like, I remember reading about, I can't remember in what century this was, but you know, a long time ago, where a group of rabbis would meet on a regular basis to study the Bible together. And the way they would do it is they would have one of them would read the text out loud. And then there would be a little silence, and then they would go around the table. And each person would speak the words or speak about how they felt during this reading. What was the message coming to them from that text? And you would always hear different messages coming through. And I think that's fantastic. That's fantastic. The Bible is so rich that is capable of, you know, of bringing out so many different aspects and messages from people's minds as they listen to that. Anyway, I'm just mentioning this as an example of the richness of this book.
Thank you, Renato, so much. We will, of course, put the links where you can buy the book or even the other books in the podcast description below. Thank you for being gracious, for all the mistakes that have been made, and sticking up with me for such a long time. We're talking for almost 3 hours now. It was a delight, and it was very interesting, and I felt so comfortable talking to you. And dear viewers and listeners, I hope you felt the same way and that you're encouraged to get this book and dive into it and read what Renato LIngs has written about also some misinterpretation, a mistranslation, and holy censorship, but also his own insights and conversations with his friend. Thank you all for being with us. I hope you enjoyed this. As mentioned in the beginning, this podcast is made in partnership with the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups. More about Renato LIngs, if you would like to find out about his personal life and how it was for him to come out and accept himself, you will find out in some of the next podcasts. So, keep looking out for this podcast to get to know him a little bit more. Until then, I say thank you all of you who are supporting this podcast, and thank you, Renato, again for being with us. From me, this is it, and all I can say, see you next time. Bye everyone, and bye Renato.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's been a pleasure.